politically savvy, morally retarded bastards at the top. That's bastard indiscriminate of sex or gender. If they are allowed to let the Israelis go and attack to suit the Bauer family, aka Rothschild's needs, then then the more dire of the predictions within our system, even going back as far as 1999, are have been raised from a level of potential to a level of probability. And the level of probability at that point is truly unknown, but should be quantifiable. And basically, it would be a question of, okay, out of the 7 billion of us, how many have they just killed?
If World War III does occur, can there be a World War III light? Or if World War III does occur, will it be full-blown thermonuclear war?
There's the rub. This is not knowable because of certain things that are going on in areas that we are not privy or savvy to. And that's why I was spending so much time here on Russian, because the way in which the Russians and the Chinese are operating, I think that they have had a huge level of weapons breakthroughs that may take what we would call World War III out of the pure thermonuclear war category. We also have such indicators within our data. And in fact, they had grown considerably in this last period, the last data run. These indicators are for a, if you will, more of a ray gun kind of a war, very much a reading like the descriptions of the Vaimani and the attacks and the in the Hindu epic, the Gita, the Bhagavad Gita, which is basically a description of a giant battle. And we're getting a lot of the language that seems to replicate that with terms that seem to go towards ray guns and stuff. So here's the problem. Our data at this point would have said that things have morphed and that the side that uses the thermonuclear weapons will lose simply because the other side is prepared to use weapons that will negate the effect of the thermonuclear. Not necessarily prevent them from going off, but make their presence not a deciding factor. There's a big difference between the warrior energy necessary to get a cruise missile or a high-range bomber with a nuclear weapon over your enemy such that you can get that bomb in place, as opposed to a beam approach to dealing with all of the weapons and all of your attacks. So if we were to postulate that the original Israeli mistake language was still in effect in its larger scale, the thing that stood out of that original set was that greater than half is how it's going to be reported. Greater than half of the attacking force was basically vaporized. Now, that vaporization at the time that we got those words way back in 2003 or 2004 when they first started appearing didn't make as much sense as it may now when we hear rumors that Iran has received a bunch of assistance from the Russians who have been diligently working on what we must think of as basically electromagnetic or ray guns, which wouldn't necessarily cause in and of themselves cause things to vaporize, but some of the words I'm getting out of the Russian spiders seem to suggest a slightly different technique is involved, and that is the hard wall. Not like our hard wall in our data gap, but rather an electromagnetic weapon that doesn't, for instance, attempt to alter the atoms of the oncoming missile, but rather alters the air right ahead of it, such that when it hits that air, it might as well have been hitting the ocean or a sack of cement. Make sense?
It does. Clif,
okay, so one last little thing about that. Our data at this point suggests that if the Israelis go ahead with that mistake, that there is indeed this extra new set involved, suggesting that there's scalar weapons in play. Now, I think at this stage, perhaps the scalar weapons are already in play, and what we think of as World War III probably began some time ago, and it's in its early covert stage at the moment, just getting ready to break out, as all the language coming out of the officialdom would seem to suggest.
Fantastic. I think there's a few more questions on that. In regards to this big picture, do you think World War III will happen before the major solar flares, if they do hit Earth?
I think the major solar flares make the World War a moot point and prevent it from occurring, but may make something even far worse. And that is in situ explosions of any of the nuclear weapons and nuclear power plants that are under the energy blast from the sun. So if you happen to be on the unlucky continent that gets that direct blast, it won't matter that the nuclear weapons that are exploding were your own. The effects will be the same as if you'd been involved in a nuclear war, but there won't be a war there. So if we get this is truly what the powers that be are afraid of. This is their overriding fear, is this upcoming period that they bind by, I think, about 23 to 24 months in terms of their window. They've got a particularly 2 periods of active anxiety that are associated with March to May of 2012. Then there's a lesser period of anxiety in the November through December period, and a much higher level. Their peak of anxiety is in through May of 2013. And they are very much concerned of the destruction of our civilization and their power base, more importantly, via these great solar flares coming in and basically taking out our ability to run a technological civilization. Now, what no one really ever talks about, except for the Russians, who are going to shut down their nuclear plants and do everything they can to shield anything nuclear and electronic from this, is that the nuclear plants that are exposed to the incoming neutrinos will get hot. Whether or not they go critical will depend on individual environments, but it is not a good thing to test in my way of thinking. I sit over here, I say this with some trepidation to a certain extent, because I sit squeezed between the ongoing problems in Japan and Hanford, which is a very large nuclear bomb basically waiting to happen.
Thank you. Do you think that the magnetic field reversal, if it does occur, will occur before or after the solar flares?
It occurs as part of it. The magnetic field is very much like the rotating magnets in any kind of a science experiment. The point at which the solar flares will begin is as we are coming into our spring and the southern hemisphere fall, shifting them into the southern hemisphere winter thereafter in our summer. If the magnetic field reacts as it has been predicted by NASA, we will see a weakening in our northern hemispheric magnetic pole and a strengthening in our southern hemispheric pole, which is not a good thing because this is also occurring on the sun. And when the sun blows out the stream, it may be we have no way of knowing at the time that until the time of the explosions actually occur what the polarity of the explosion will be. If it is also southern polarity, it will blow our magnetic sphere around us like some kind of a ball or a cage around a ball, and the holes in it will allow the radiations to come through. The ozone hole is actually, there's a number of them now, so we'll get this big blast of radiation if the polarity is right. If it's northern polarity, it's less damaging, and those particles would be swept up our magnetic lines. We would get huge levels of aurora borealis all the way down into the equator likely, but less levels of damage. So it's kind of a crapshoot. We just won't know until we get there. But I do know that it now makes sense. A lot of the uses of cement and some of the other resources and a lot of the playing around that the powers that be on the other side of officialdom have been doing. And they are very much getting ready for, let's just say, March of this coming year to May of 2013. And then they sort of plan on breathing a sigh of relief if they are both alive and have their power structure intact in May of 2013. The Russians are betting otherwise, though. The Russians are making a huge bet as a social body that there will be vast levels of damage. Now they have something that's going to affect them, and that is that it won't affect us as much, and that is the sheer size of the Eurasian continent means that it is statistically much more likely to take a direct hit, and so they are taking that into account.
And last one in regard to the big picture, obviously Robert Felix's work shows that magnetic reversals precede an ice age. So the last part of the big picture is, do you see that the most important things in our future, I mean, apart from the events, is radiation and ice?
The ice component was really clear in our last report, and even the report before that showed a lot of gain in those particular sets. So I would agree that that's a very fair statement. That the if you were to expand the ice concept and just put a more personal label of deleterious effects on weather or those things that might personally affect my climate, I think that's going to be how people will actually conceive of it. But in general, the ice label is really accurate. Whether or not, though, the ice age occurs, I think is problematic because we have some wrinkles this time in the 100,000-year cycle that we haven't in the past two that are the main basis for Felix's work. There's some other cycles that are larger than the 100,000-year alteration of our orbit with which polar cycles or ice ages are synced. And there's appears to be an irregularity in the 100,000-year cycle that may also be linked up with a gap, if you will, of an ice age when there should have been one. So 400,000 years back, we should have had an ice age, and there wasn't one at that time. And there are some interesting things that the Mayans may have known about it, and that's why the long count is popping up, I think.
Okay, thank you, Cliff. Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to clarify because obviously in your forecast you say a lot of things. you go through many different topics. So I just wanted to try to get a big picture from you of what you still think will be occurring in the future. So thank you for that. Okay, we have Ruski who's got a question on Israel and World War III.
Hi, Cliff.
Hello.
One of my curiosities is why would the Israeli populace risk a war against Iran, considering that they are likely to suffer terribly if scalar and nuclear weapons are deployed? I mean, they will be smack dab in the middle of it, and Iran in of itself does not have a history of invading other countries. I think for perhaps a couple hundred years, the last time since the Persians have actually actively invaded any other country other than responding to Iraq. Sort of wanted to know if the webbots had anything to say about that or what your analysis or what your view would be.
I don't, as a rule, answer why questions because that goes to intent. But I do understand your line of reasoning there in the question itself is how can the Israelis possibly allow this? And it may be that they have been brainwashed to the point that they are good little robots, good little mechanoids of the Rothschild Empire, whose emblem they have on their national flag, the Merkaba, the intertwined tetrahedrons. And it's not an Israeli symbol. It's not even historically a Judaic symbol. It's a symbol of having to do with the sun and so on in hyperspace. But the Rothschilds have taken it over. So I think really, from the Israelis I've talked to, or that's kind of self-selective because the only ones that talk to me are basically aware. All the others think I'm some kind of an anti-Semite or an anti-Israeli or an anti-Jewish guy, none of which is the case. But the Israelis I've talked to are very much aware that they are literally in the frying pan and the fire is turned up and they're about ready to set the pan on it. And they know they will be glazed over. Many of them are very concerned about this, but they do not, like us, have an effective method for stopping what they see coming down the pike. I don't know how they're going to react. Our data showed 5 major points of death within Israel as the response, delayed response to the Israeli mistake. And it's kind of like if you were to read the original discussion of that, the Israelis attacked Iran, lost half of their incoming attackers, suffered a 50% or greater casualty rate, were able to inflict damage on Iran. There was a hiatus, a collective hiatus for days that may even stretch out a couple of weeks, in which the Israelis and the Americans were basically given a cool down period and many warnings. Then the data went on to suggest that hiatus broke as a result of the Israelis making an aggressive move, which was not even allowed to exit the boundaries of Israel before these 5 cities were basically turned into glass. And the Israeli issue and the way it was phrased within the officialdom